We're live.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so happy to have you guys joining Hubelo and TSNN on today's webinar on how to use event data to drive ROI. Today, I'm joined by two expert panelists who have co-founded two very different companies in the event industry. Speaking about how we collect data at events is our first panelist, Michael Arp. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Michael Arp, co-founder and president of Bright AV. We're a full service production team that's been doing a ton of virtual and hybrid events. So have a lot of insights into what's been going on out there in the industry and learnings. And my background is in hospitality and production. And yeah, happy to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And speaking about how data analysis actually happens after the event is president and co-founder Joe Colangelo. Joe, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and Bear Analytics?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Bear, we've been around for about 8 years. My co-founder Eric and I, we kind of cut our teeth in the events industry on the association side, running a portfolio of events there. And when we realized, how mission critical understanding the data in and around events was going to be going forward, we started Bear. And of course, that's only been supercharged kind of through the pandemic once we moved into, I think, fully the virtual space. And now as we return to some hybrid / in-person models, we're seeing data is more important than ever.
Fantastic. I think everyone can agree who's joined today how important this topic is, and also how confusing it is because things are happening and changing so quickly in the industry. So we're going to dive right into some of the nitty-gritty basics. So, can you tell us a little bit about what tools you're using to measure success before, during, and after an event? And we're going to start with Michael Arp here, who's actually hosting events around the clock, and tell us what tools you're using.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference now is the sort of software that's utilized for virtual, hybrid, and even live events is much more widely accessible, accepted, has become part of our day-to-day in the events world. So that does allow for a lot more data gathering through audience engagement tools such as polling and social Q&A and a lot of other things that were maybe a nice to have before have really become more central to the attendee experience, specifically definitely in the association space. I think that's a big piece of what's been out there in the association space where you've got to track attendance or offer CE credits. And there's a lot more tools like Hubelo, that are available now to be able to gather that data and give it over to Joe and tell us what to do with it. But yeah, we obviously specialized in the production of that content and seeing how to attract more attendees and offer more relevant information is really the end goal.
Fantastic. How about you, Joe? So we've gotten some feedback from Michael about, how some of the tools that he's using to gather this information. What about you? Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, sure. I could speak a little bit to the evolution that Michael was talking about because, for quite a while, surveys and focus groups, and those were kind of the very dominant mechanism for understanding and, trying to kind of hint at or pinpoint ROI, for events. And over, I would say, even the last 10 years, as we started to see things become more digitized for strictly just in person on the app side. And now, of course, the average virtual event's doing 5 to 10x as much data collection, whether it's some of the mechanisms that Michael mentioned around feedback, structured or unstructured, networking, the product or, kind of exhibit hall affiliates, which is why we kind of we've positioned our Bear IQ product to be able to ingest a multitude, way more data than we even analyzed pre-pandemic, because the versatility and the variability in the data is just so different now, which is exciting because there's a lot more that you can glean from it. And there's a lot more, I know we're going to get into this a little later, but there's a lot more than then you can use it for, especially when you're talking about, event engineering and event design, things like that.
Fantastic. And this is a very, very sensitive question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think everybody wants to know, who owns the data? What's your opinion on this?
Yeah,
Michael?
so I can kick that. Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to kick it right over to Joe. Yeah, definitely,
Okay.
definitely love to hear Joe's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty simple from our standpoint. It all starts with the event organizer. They're the owner of the data. We sit in the stack as like a data processor. I think like most event tech platforms, it's really critical that you put that ownership on the organizer for a variety of reasons, because it also centralizes privacy, and then we're really the arbiters of things like security and carrying through those privacy protocols. I know there's quite a bit of debate going on around it, but I think ultimately this is where the industry is gonna land. Probably majority of it already sits, but is going to land at the end of the day.
The only thing, Lisa, I'd add to that is I think like everything's different now, right? I think including contracting. I think that's really where you start to look at that is what does the contract say with your sort of, platform, venue, however you want to describe that. There probably wasn't a lot of attention to that previously. Also with recorded content, we see in a lot of our contracts that we're recording content that was hybrid or virtual, and that does belong, to the group that's contracted, but sometimes that needs to be clearly defined in a contract. So I think it's a new clause. I think it's something that you're addressing in a contracting phase, and like a lot of different things is sort of new post COVID.
And that's a fantastic point, because that really speaks to the value of data going up. Because if this stuff didn't matter, then there wouldn't be necessarily the requirements to go through the level of diligence that Michael just articulated. Right. So are people being more diligent about it today than they were 5-10 years ago? I think unequivocally you can say, yeah. And so then it just speaks to the inherent underlying value of the asset, in this case, the data.
Exactly, because there's so much you can actually, do with that data, which actually is a nice segue into the next question I had, which is, what existing data can event planners use today to influence their hybrid planning? Because, if you think about it, there's a lot of people, I think there's a lot of event planners in our audience today who have been involved in the traditional events, and then they're just dipping their toe into the whole hybrid virtual event space. And, they may not necessarily have gotten their first taste of all the data that comes from a virtual event. So what examples of data are, can the event planners use today? And then, we can talk about how that's going to evolve later with virtual. So do we want to actually start with Michael, because I know you've spent a lot of time with collecting data, just in the live space, and sort of how that's changed with virtual.
Yeah, I think with the live space and the sort of live stream, there's analytics available to track the number of viewers, where you have sort of peak data on, you may have somebody on a live stream trail off at a certain point, what was being talked about at that point. I think another sort of product of the evolution that we're going through in the event space is we're finding that content has always been king. It's a cliche that I think we've been talking about for a long time, but I think that's even more important. I found myself sort of consulting with a lot of traditional planners and sort of third parties about what the difference is in a virtual space. And what I kept finding myself doing is comparing it to broadcasting live TV, or you're competing with Netflix, or you're competing with all this different content out there. This person's at their desk now instead of in a ballroom. They're not a captive audience, so there's a need to really understand what your attendees want to see, what they want to hear from your presenters, and deliver that sort of becomes even more central to designing your program, designing your content, getting your speakers in place, because again, we've just gotten used to having everything at our fingertips and being able to consume content in a bunch of different ways. So how do you utilize that data, understand what exactly do your attendees want, and how can you deliver that to them, whether it's virtual or back in the ballroom? Because now are people going to be as excited about sitting in a ballroom for 8 hours? I don't know, right? Like, I think that everything has changed, and we're seeing that when we do get back into the meeting spaces, that shorter, more concise sessions, more relevant to the audience, seems to the what we've gone through in the last year and a half has fueled that as a priority for a lot of organizations and a lot of teams.
Great. How about you, Joe? What existing data do you think event planners can use to influence their hybrid planning?
Yeah, so I mean, right now we're at the fundamental point for determining, what is the level of hybrid that folks are going to invest in. So I don't know how one makes that decision without having, 10, 15 events under your belt and learnings from that, without using kind of the data to see, like, what are our persona types that are engaging. A lot of the tone of what Michael said, like, what are our persona types and what kind of content are they consuming in the online virtual world? What are some of the things that win there? And then I like that back to the ballroom. I'm definitely going to keep that one for later. But what is the profile of the session, the person, the learning scenario where the back in the ballroom then wins? And then how do you double down on both of those things? One thing that resonated with me that Michael said was, broadcasting. You think about kind of the old school TV, limited amount of channels. You had to watch the shows when they came on, and you were kind of force fed those. I was my uncle's kind of first remote control, kind of pushing the buttons back in the day, right? Now, the biggest challenge is in and around discovery. There's so much. How do I find exactly what I want to look for? And I think we're kind of going through our own moment in that regard in the events industry. But the one thing that's going to happen is, I think unequivocally, whether you're in the ballroom or online or digital, is that the quality of the content is going to have to be there, because people just don't, refinement of palates have gone up, right? And so everyone.
Yeah. Well, I have to laugh because I remember, I've put together quite a few events, in the millions of dollars, and for one event, right? And I remember, like, the biggest piece of data we had was the engagement survey, or the attendee survey afterwards, which was like, how did you feel about the food and beverage? How did you feel about the venue? Was there enough parking? Was there, and it's sort of like, when I think about that data compared to what the stakes are now, and the data that people, that we use from the virtual events, like, which sessions were people most engaged in, which people, which sessions, where did they drop off, right? Which influencers actually drove the most registrations? Like, you can get all of that information now, and it's just kind of mind blowing for someone who did, the traditional live in-person events for so long. I do laugh at myself sometimes at just how, how much I've grown or have had to grow.
Well, it's exactly right. It's progressive, right? Because it feels analog, yeah. But at the time, that was the best in breed.
Oh yeah, yeah, and you'd go in front of the execs and you'd say, "Hey, look, 98% of the people said that they love the event." And of course, they were, we gave them the attendee survey while they were at the cocktail party, and so they were, make sure we get the highest, ratings possible, because everyone's like, "I had a great time." But nowadays, you're right to say that it's the palette, and also because of the number of events that are available now, right? You have to make it super relevant to them, which actually leads into my, my next question, which is, how are you using the data to personalize the audience experience now, whether it's through content or other parts of the live or virtual event? I'll start with Michael, since Joe answered the last one first.
I think it's sort of similar mindset of really customizing the content for your audience to keep them engaged and to offer them what they're looking for. I think the other side of it, again, back to sort of the association space, or even if we do a lot of webinar series for corporate clients or, things like that as well, where they may have a sponsor or they may have a message from somebody else that has a stake in it. And I think utilizing that data for their use, right? For those other partners, those other stakeholders, those sponsors to know how many people were in there, what did they engage with, where did they go after that? If I'm speaking in a virtual space, of course, where you might have people attend a session and then go to an exhibitor's booth, a virtual exhibitor booth after that. In the traditional sense, that was hard to track. That was something that wasn't as readily available, where now it's a lot easier to see where that attendee experience, the sort of, the path of that attendee experience, which, going back to another silver lining, is sponsors and other stakeholders love to see that, right? They can say, I had 200 people that saw this message, and then 50 people that joined this my booth after that. That's a really powerful way to go back to whoever's sort of holding the budget to say, we got some really good return on this investment, but by tracking that a little more concrete through, again, a platform. And I mean, you can do that in the ballroom now too. And again, we just did a big event where we had the Hublot app as part of the event, and we utilized that for engagement pieces in the ballroom as well, and sort of being able to carry that back and look at that data, I think is really interesting to those guys like Joe that that do that, right? So
yeah, so let's get on to the other side of this. So once we gather this data to personalize audience, what about you, Joe? Well, how do you use that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story arc here too is the personalization. Folks were big on personalization kind of pre-pandemic in the events industry, and it really manifested itself in two ways. There's some pretty cool on-site experience things being done. There's some technology advancements, especially like on the app side, and maybe a little bit on the registration side, things like that. But it was really on the marketing and attendee acquisition where you were starting to see some personalized messages, marketing automation, drip campaign by some sophisticated groups. But again, we're entering a whole new ballgame now, because there's so much to be gleaned on the per individual basis. You're going to see, just like with hybrid, where you're talking about kind of two, let's call it content delivery experiences, you're going to be able to see the personalization targeting that you're going to learn from some virtual aspects, then bleed into the in-person. I'll give you an example. By understanding myself as an attendee and knowing which pieces of content that I've engaged with, and if let's say in this case I generally tied to start to sway into panels and sessions that are around data and events. Well, when I start to then be targeted to attend events, that information is now readily available to say folks like yourselves have found value in these type of events. And so we're going to see, because the actual net universe of data is increasing, the ability to personalize on both sides is going to increase. And hopefully what that does is reduce the noise to decision making for the actual individual who's attending or the organization that's thinking about participating at an event. And that's a little bit utopian. I'll get directly to your question, which is content right now. Because it was so hard to track in a strictly in-person way, like usage in and around sessions, unless you were doing things like beacon deployments and things like that. It's been the number one kind of growth area for folks that have asked us to look into. Now I want to understand my audience and who's participating in certain sessions. Can you get me lookalike personas, things like that? So again, another area that we're constantly building on in our platform, because there's just huge demand for it right now.
It's interesting because one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the conferences now have like 50 plus sessions, which is that's a lot of sessions. Like if I had to go to a conference like for 5 days and go to 50 plus sessions, I mean, I don't know if anybody could could stay awake for all of that. But I realized that part of the strategy for doing that is that part of the personalization is allowing people to go to the sessions that actually are most relevant to them versus the sessions that you as event organizers necessarily want for them to go to, right? So, so if you have a virtual or hybrid event, someone can decide that, I'm going to go to this first day live, so I can go see all my friends and, have the cocktail party. And then I'm going to do this session, this session, this session over the next 3 days. And it's just far more efficient because it's the things that they're actually interested in, as opposed to, a very, very narrow focus. But then the result of that is that when these people actually attend those events, then you have a better idea of these 50 sessions, which ones had the most universal appeal and which ones were like more niche, right? And that information is valuable in personalizing your content journey either way. Either you hit those people with very, very unique content that that it's only they'd be interested in, because like clearly not very many people went to these sessions, but or you create that broader content that is universally appealing to everyone. And I think that's a great way to impact the rest of the marketing organization, apart from just the event strategy. So something to think
I agree with that, because there's a fine line between like engineering what somebody should see and getting them to cut through the noise to hear. Most folks have kind of this 3-tiered system, which is like content I need to see, content I would like to see, and then everything else is kind of noise.
Right. Exactly. Because it's just not relevant to them. And let's be honest, so many topics are so convoluted. There's so many different aspects of it that there's just no way to have, a broad agreement across for everybody. Right. And the whole point of, I think, evolution to some degree where we are today is that everybody's unique and everybody's individual, and that's okay. So cater to their individuality instead of trying to group them together as a big macro segment. So okay, so let's talk about the next question, which is what are the missed opportunities that you think event planners should look at more closely when they're planning hybrid events? Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm gonna, good key takeaway, I think, for everybody is better content, more relevant to the attendees. I think that's probably the biggest opportunity, especially in an elective sort of, at a conference where the attendees can choose their own participation track. I think just what you guys were just talking about, what Joe alluded to about the beacons, RFID beacons, really expensive. You're spending $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to install this beacon system throughout and track where people are going and do this whole thing. And now I think there's just a lot more tools available and a lot more teams like a Bright AV production team that knows how to use those tools. And for a fraction of the cost, you could start to collect that data and then customize that content. So I think that's a big opportunity that, maybe people weren't as interested in that because they knew it was complex or it was expensive to sort of, gather that information. And now I think through platforms, mobile apps, and a little bit of attendee instruction that you can gather that data easier and then, continue to build on what people want to see from that. So the only other thing I wanted to mention, and again, this is something that is a little bit new as a result of all the virtual activity, is the sort of the matchmaking, and sort of, networking opportunities. I know Joe mentioned it earlier. Again, in the past, I mean, there's all these really cool products that you can, the badge can have an RFID and you can pre-register and say that you live in Cleveland. And if you get next to somebody else that lives in Cleveland, it'll light up. That stuff's really cool. That was around. I think now though, through software, you can ask some of those questions ahead of time. And then through the portal that they're looking at, whether it's the app or the website or whatever, that you might say, hey, you should really, connect with Bill. He's also from Cleveland and like, you guys are in the same industry. Maybe you should connect, right? And it can maybe even offer you a tool to schedule that meeting, through a software. So again, all that stuff is just more accessible. It's easier to use. You know, companies like Hublot made big investments in that software over the course of the pandemic. So it's just out there, available. And again, like my team knows all that stuff now. Pre-pandemic, they probably wouldn't have, you know, known a lot about how to use that kind of stuff, but we're like borderline experts at that kind of stuff now. So it's really cool to see those additional tools come into the meeting space as, you know, technology tools to utilize, you know, data gathering and sort of attendee management.
That's a great answer. As a introvert, I highly approve of the, like, you know, matchmaking, just because I'm so shy that I don't actually go and meet anybody at events. I wait for someone to come up to me because I'm too nervous. So yeah, that matchmaking kind of gives you that intro of just like, hey, my app says we should meet.
Yeah, exactly.
So how about you, Joe? What do you think the biggest missed opportunities are right now?
Yeah, mine. My answer to this is much simpler. A lot of folks have they're asking really good questions at the organizer level. They want to better their events in very specific ways, and they understand how measurement and analytics helps get them there. And, you know, I love it when somebody comes with like, hey, a long list of, you know, does your product do all of these things? And we check, you know, we're going through the list together. But all of that is rate limiting if the collection and the transfer of the data doesn't happen. So you have to have a good inventory management approach and strategy to where does my data live. Not necessarily a huge problem if you just had your flagship event in the last 3 to 6 months. But then what do people want to say? I want to compare it to history. I want to benchmark it against other events we have. And then you start to see the gaps in not necessarily the collection, because that's typically on the platform, but then let's actually transfer the data over into either a system or something that's very simple, like a spreadsheet or a series of spreadsheets where it's readily available. And so we're oftentimes tasked with dance data monkey dance, but we can do some pretty cool stuff. But if the data's not there, then that's rate limiting. Right. So that's kind of the first thing that I just want to impress on folks, is just make sure that you have a good handle on where your information is.
That's a great answer. And I will always remember the dance data monkey dance line. It's my favorite.
And the only thing I would add to that, just because I'm pretty close to, you know, event budgets as a whole, is what do you budget for that? You know, like how do you incorporate that as a line item, like data management, into your pre-event, you know, budget as you're taking it to the attendees and selling, or to your stakeholders? You're selling that to the stakeholders. Hey, stakeholders, you know, we really need to make sure we're storing this data so that in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, we have a trend, and we have, like, you know, I think most people that are looking at it holistically get excited about that. I know, you know, at a certain level of an organization, they're going to think that's really cool, but as a planner, you need, you know, that needs to be in there. And I have no idea what that costs, but, you know, it's a question to answer.
Well, you know,
that's exactly right.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Well, no, I was just going to make a kind of a flippant comment that it's, you know, it's effectively like a marketing team setting up their budget and then saying, you know what, we actually didn't think to put an email tool database as part of the budget. Like, it's fundamental. It's rate limiting, right? So you're absolutely right, Michael.
Well, and you know, for my answer in terms of, you know, what opportunities I think event planners are missing right now, as they, you know, I think one of the opportunities that they miss is that, you know, for instance, Hublot provides 24/7 customer support, and it's before, during, and after the event, right? And what people always want, you know, the CSM to be there before the event for the dry runs, and then they want the, you know, CSM to be in the green room during the event in case anything goes wrong, which is totally fine. You know, we provide all of that, but then after the event, they're like, okay, well, we're done with the event. Whew, thank God. And they fail to actually ask the CSM for the data. right? Or to even explain the data. What does the data mean? And I think there's actually a really big missed opportunity there, because the CSM knows, your customer support person, whatever platform you choose, should know exactly, like, these are the top 5 sessions you had. This is, the number of interactions. They should be able to provide that summary to you like immediately, within 24 hours of your event. And very few people actually bother with any of that. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity, because that data is going to be valuable today and 5 years down the line when you see the trends, right? And whether you're getting better and better at events. I think the other missed opportunity, we tend to focus a lot when we talk about hybrid on the virtual experience, and like, how do we make the virtual experience more like the live experience? But I can tell you, I actually went to a live event a few weeks ago, which was the first live event I went to, I think in like 18 months. And the thing I was missing in the ballroom was the chat features, the emojis, the GIFs, the things that you get to do when you're on a virtual event. And I was like, well, where's the other screen for that? And nobody had thought of that, and there were house parties going on as well. But they were not represented in the live experience. And so I think if event planners are looking at planning hybrid events, they should look at some of the benefits that the virtual experience can actually bring into your live experience, so that you have audience engagement in the ballroom as well as online. Because I remember sitting there going, I actually don't know how to sit here quietly anymore and just listen to somebody speak. I want to be participating in the conversation and I can't do it. So anyway, all right. So last question, gentlemen, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. How will audience demographics shift how we do events? And knowing full well that we have a younger generation of attendees that are coming, they obviously have different, it reminds me of when like millennials, like 10 years ago, everyone was like freaked out about millennials, but now we have Gen Z. So how do you think this is going to shape our hybrid events of the future?
Yeah, so I can start, because I'm not, this is probably something not while it's interesting to me, probably not an area of expertise. However, what I'm seeing, I can share what I'm seeing out there is, again, I'll use association as a category. So I think a lot of people would go to a conference because they get to see everybody that they've seen every year and sort of network and do those kind of things. I think now that you have a new younger group of individuals that are more digital, right? They're more digital. They do things digitally that guys like me would do in an analog way. And I think that that's going to drive a lot of planners needing to think about that content, that experience in a different way, that you still need to make it accessible to somebody that maybe doesn't want to get on an airplane and come in, or a presenter. You might have a hotshot presenter you want to bring in, but they're not big on getting in front of a group of people for 1,000 people. So are you pre-producing their message and bringing them in for so I think just thinking about those demographics, I don't know if that's data related or super helpful, but I'm definitely seeing that trend of thinking about the digital audience and the live audience, and sort of balancing between those two. I
don't think any of us are experts. That's kind of why we need data.
Totally.
I don't understand this next generation, and I'm the parents of 4 of them. And so I need data. But what about you, Joe?
I mean, similar tones when we're looking at the data for the last, let's call it, year on what have largely been, virtual events. We've seen the audiences categorically gotten younger or earlier in their profession is probably a better way of categorizing it. It's also been more geographically diverse, because obviously the barriers to travel are very different. In most cases, there were hard restrictions on travel. And it's relatively easy to jump onto a virtual experience. And we've seen actively more senior decision making, reliable, loyal attendees kind of punt their event experiences in the virtual world until things manifest themselves back together in person. So I don't think it's unfair to draw the line between, kind of age or generation and how folks are consuming kind of the two prevailing modalities of events. But it's pretty clear that everyone has their own expectation for like return on experience, whether you're in person or you're virtual. And there's going to be a lot of, individuals that are going to cross those lines pretty regularly and pretty aggressively, but I think their expectations are going to be, very different. And the pricing has showcased that. So there hasn't really been, the ability to comparably price virtual events and hit the same expectation, because the idea is not to recreate the physical world in the virtual world. And now everyone's learned that lesson. There's other huge monetization opportunities, but it's not going to be exactly the same. And so people are making their own individualized decisions based on what they perceive as the experience in both modalities. And the other thing I would say is this is like the bottom of the first inning here.
Yeah.
Right. Like we've all lived a lot of life in the last 2 years, and we've been like, man, this, there's a lot coming at us, and everyone's been working harder and all that stuff. But in terms of the technology is still at its infancy relative to where this is going to be.
Absolutely.
Right. So we don't really know.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I don't think anybody thought, 20 years ago when social media first came out, how ubiquitous it would become. It was like, oh, this thing is college kids are doing, right? But like now all of our marketing is sort of, revolved around social media in a lot of ways. So yeah, we're just starting on everything that's going to happen. All right, well, okay, that's good. We actually have some audience questions that I'm gonna relay back to you guys. And again, the questions are open if anybody in the audience wants to ask our experts here. The first question is from Jessica Sabia. If we don't own the data because the show organizer owns it, how do we access the data points that are most meaningful to us as event planners? Is there a way to compel this info from the owner?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first crack at that one, because it's quite literally the scenario we're in, every day. Unlike Michael and his group, where they're kind of the data generators and on the front lines of being at the point of creation of the data, we're not. We plug into all of those platforms and companies, so we're reliant on some type of approval of, yes, you can, have access to this data for this purpose. I think you kind of already have the answer in the way that the question was written, was that with that word compel. So if you bring a plan and say, hey, look, we know you have good data sitting here. We believe you have information about attendees, demographics, content, when it was consumed by how many people. Here's what we want to do with it. And we're talking 4 or 5 bullet points. I don't think this needs to be a thesis. I would be shocked if the organizer or the data owner in this case wouldn't look to you as a trusted partner and say, yeah, I want to glean insight for how you're looking at this. Unless they're doing it themselves, or there's some other substitute, this seems to me to just be really a question of artfully putting together that compelling case. In my experience, almost no one says no to this, unless there's a good, kind of, you're dealing with an event that's in like the DoD, state secret, government kind of space, and there's a reason that you can't be compelled to take a look at this data. But outside of those kind of cases, I think if you ask the question in a nice way, you'll be surprised at how readily they'll let you take a look at it and how much interest they'll have in what you find.
Great. Okay. And then one more question. If you could change any one thing about how we measure the ROI of events, what would it be? I'll start with Michael.
Oh boy. I go back to the attendee experience, honestly, because I think so much ties back to that. I know, again, depending on the type of event it is, whether it's, you're launching a product, or you're an association offering, continuing education credits, or whatever it is, that attendee experience is really what's going to drive the results, good or bad, in my experience. And that comes back to the stuff that I keep talking about, which is better content, easier accessibility for presenters, attendees, etc. And thinking about it in a more, it's what digital, era that we're in, and sort of being aware of that. And that doesn't always mean you got to spend, another 50% on a hybrid component. I think a lot of people get caught up in that a little bit, where like, oh, we're not going to do hybrid because it's too expensive, or we don't want to think about broadcasting the general session because it's just so much more money. And I just remind everybody, there are tiers to doing it, right? There are things, I mean, we bring people into Zoom and bring people into a ballroom for little to no additional cost. And then we also produce live streams with lower thirds and animated intros. And, so the attendees that are virtual are seeing something. So again, I'm going off track again, but I'm kind of going back to what I know I've seen work, which is focusing on that attendee experience and utilizing the data to improve that.
Great answer. And Joe, what about you? What would you change? How, if we could change anything about how we measure the ROI of events?
Yeah, I think there's, and I think this is going to be kind of pivoted coming out of the pandemic, but there was, obviously a really huge emphasis put on just number of attendees. That was like a really clear benchmark, attendees, square footage, meeting rooms, we kind of have these like top level, it's about size, it's about size, it's about size. And I think what you just heard Michael say is, there's something that's, albeit a little squishier, but it's going to materially impact the success of your event, which is what is the attendee experiencing. I can tell you that there's a couple of direct metrics. So retention, year-to-year retention, and then a loyalty spectrum. How many times did we see an individual participate in the last 3, 4, 5 events, 5 years, whenever your event cadence is? And then what is your first-time attendees renewal or retention rate coming back? Like, those things are materially critical to understanding if you have an event that's going up, down, or sideways. And once you know what those metrics are, then the question becomes, what part of your experience should you be doubling down on, and what part should you be jettisoning? And I think that that's often the thing that we find is the most challenging when we were doing a managed service company, and now as we're engaging with very large technology companies and they're shooting a whole bunch of events our way. It's really hard to cut that bottom 10-15% of what's working, because it's not readily transparent what isn't working. And so you have to kind of set these benchmarks and then go, you know what, we're going to have to take maybe a hard line and say, our key member, we'll go to the association space where Michael lives, because I'm sure he's heard this all the time. This track or this session exists because this key cohort of members says we have to have it. And then you look at the performance and you're like, it's 2 standard deviations away from anything else. Like, that's got to go, or it's got to get reimagined, or that I think is the hardest thing, is actually to do more of the better things and just less of everything.
That's a great response. I think for me, one of the metrics that I think should be more of a higher priority for event planners are actually the diversity of speakers. I think there's been some research done, and I can't find the stat right now, but where most of the speakers are not very diverse in comparison to the population in the United States. And I think that there's something that we can do better on that. I think if we do better on that, actually we would end up with more interesting content and just better attendance, because of representation. And part of the reason I really like virtual events is because of the inclusivity aspect of it, and that more people can actually come to some of these events that happen. But that would be my change that I do for if I could do anything about how we measure ROI on events. So great. Well, I think we have one more question. Looking at data collection and budgeting, how much more would you estimate the cost for a face-to-face plus hybrid versus only a face-to-face event?
Well, for production, I can say production while Joe thinks about the data collection, because I think if you're just talking about additional cost for the production aspect of a face-to-face plus hybrid, it can vary anywhere from a 10% increase all the way up to probably a 50% increase for production, again, depending on the level of, do you have a full end-to-end platform, or are you just streaming to a microsite, or are you just recording for on demand later, or are you, or are you doing a full live, stream during a session? As far as collecting the data, I can't speak to that, but I'm wondering maybe if Joe can.
Yeah, I can give you kind of our 2 cents on this, and it's if you're starting from scratch, then the difference on capturing the equivalent amount of data in person as online is going to be cost prohibitive for just about anybody. But the reality is you probably shouldn't be trying to do the same thing in both spaces. So the virtual event space is going to be, data collection kind of comes with the platform, natively. In terms of what we're, just to be transparent, like what we charge from an analysis standpoint, it's a negligible difference. It's just, we have in-person data sources, we have hybrid or virtual data sources. So that's not really a huge portion of the expense. It's really on the collection piece in person if you're really trying to get elaborate with your deployments on measuring technologies, whether it's like LiDAR, RFID, beacon, what have you, trying to measure what everyone's doing, sessions, networking, one-on-one, and then analyze all of that in an unstructured space. The juice, it probably isn't going to be worth the squeeze. You're going to want to you're going to narrow in and focus on a couple of things that are bang for your buck, like leads, the exhibit floor, maybe structured networking, and then, gateway checks into keynotes and things like that. Things where you need to report out for sponsors. So your approach, let me put it this way, your data approach is probably also likely going to be hybrid in that environment, and that'll help mitigate cost, and your bang for your buck should be the best if you do that right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This was an absolutely wonderful event. Thank you for coming in and sharing your expertise. And with that, I think we are done. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it. Take care.